Hello, this is the video presentation for Compy 560, project number 3, socket programming. Opening my terminal emulator right now, and the reason why I'm aligning them horizontally is because the text doesn't fit unless I align them this way. And you won't be able to see the output from the server and the client. On the top, I'm gonna have the Volta server, which will have the client code and the client running on it. And on the bottom, I'm going to have the JSON server that's going to have the server code and the server running on it. First, I have to execute the code for the server. And then I have to execute the code for the client. But the client takes two different command line arguments, which are the IP address of the server and the port number that it's listening in on. After I run the client, it asks me to input a string. So I'm going to put my first and last name and a random string. And the client sends the original string to the server. When it gets to the server, this is the string. It reverses the string, and then it sends it back to the client, and the client receives the reverse string, which is right here. Okay, now I'm going to show the code. For the client, it's basically taking two command line arguments right here, then it's parsing it and assigning them to variables called IP address and port number, which will get used later. I declare a couple of global variables which will get used later as well, such as the message and the buffer and the server structure, message length variable, and the socket variable. I take input from the user and I assign it to the message variable, and I print it out to the screen. I create the socket, and I also check to make sure that the socket creation was successful. And then here for the server struct, I assign different variables to it, which are the IP address, the IPv4 type of internet protocol it's going to use, and the port number from the command line argument. And then I issue a command or a connect uh, function, which uses the socket that I created earlier to connect to the server that I specified by the IP address. If there's any error in it prints out to the console if there was a connection error. This is where after the socket connection has been established, I send the data through this send function, which is the string, the random string which I input it into the console. And if there's any error in the send, then I print to the console that there was a send failed. If not, I print to the console that the data was sent. And then I wait for a return reply from the client on this line, on line 50 line. I wait for the return reply, and once the server has returned its reverse string, I print it out to the console on line 60. And then I close the socket and I terminate the program on the client side for the server. It's very similar. I don't have any command line arguments for the server, so it goes straight into creating the global variables, which are very similar to the client side. I create the socket. I check to make sure the socket doesn't have any the socket didn't create any errors. I assign the address of the client right here, and I assign the attributes of the client to this address structure. I bind the structure using this bind function, and I also print out to the console if there are any errors. And then I also start listening on the client side to wait for the connection from the client. Once the connection has been established, I set the variable of the client, the variables of the client, such as the IP address and the port number, using these two commands, or these two lines, 50 and 51. And if there is any errors in this, I also print to the console. And then I receive whatever on line 66 I receive the message sent from the client, and I print it out to the console. Lines 71 through 84 are where I take the string that the client sent to me and I reverse it. I'm basically just using a for loop that iterates through each array and swaps the beginning value of the message with the last value of the reverse string variable. Once I reverse the string, I print it out to the server console, and then I send it on line 86. I send it back to the client to make sure and if there's any error in the send back to the client, I print out an error. If not, I print out that the send back to the client was successful. And then the final step is to close both the client socket and the server socket and terminate the server program. There's 4 questions that we'll answer now. The first question was, what are sockets and on which layer do they operate? Sockets are the interface layer between the application layer and the transport layer. They help the application layer to send and receive data over a network by either offering a UDP or TCP protocol to the application layer. Sockets are considered only an interface, and therefore they operate between the two layers, which are the application layer and the transport layer. Question number 2 was differentiate between TCP and UDP. Was this assignment based on TCP or UDP? And does YouTube use TCP or UDP? My answer is TCP is a connection-oriented protocol, meaning that it first establishes a handshake between two different machines. Once the connection has been established, the connection remains open until there is a signal to end the connection and both machines end the network connection. YouTube uses a TCP connection to reliably transfer data through a network socket. Question number 3 was, what will happen if I use an out-of-range port number in my code, and will I encounter an error? If an out-of-range port number is used, the operating system's firewall will block its connection, and a connection error will occur, and a socket will not be established. Only ports that have been opened through the operating system's firewall will be able to accept incoming or outgoing network traffic. The last question was, what is the maximum number of sockets that a client and server can have? And the maximum number for most socket interfaces, the maximum number of sockets allowed per each connection between an application and the TCP/IP sockets interface is 65,535 sockets. That's the end of my video presentation for COMPI 560 project number 3. Thank you very much.